Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here today to discuss tiger conservation in shared landscapes. And here I am myself, Dr. Shreya Sethi. I'm currently the Associate Coordinator, Tiger Conservation, looking specifically at the issues of human tiger conflict and coexistence in WWF Wildlife and Habitats Division. And here we have Dr. Aritra Kshettry, who is basically the lead elephant program of WWF India, and he holds a PhD in human elephant and human leopard conflict, working on grassroots level issues and ensuring security and livelihood sustenance for local communities. Hi, Aritra.
Hi Shreya, nice to be here.
So, shall we discuss and elaborate more about these shared spaces and how we share habitats with a lot of wildlife and what are the repercussions, opportunities, and challenges?
Sure, Shreya. So I'm very curious to know, given that recently the tiger numbers were announced at the country level, and however, there are also reports of tiger presence in non-forest landscapes like sugarcane plantations in UP, Dudhwa, for example, and other landscapes across India. So, what do you think are the opportunities for conserving tigers beyond the boundaries of our protected areas in India?
Okay. So I think in that sense, like you've already highlighted, that the importance is looking beyond protected areas. Now we need to, with the increasing tiger population, animals often use corridor spaces, which are, between protected areas, which could be any land use. It could be a farmland, it could be patches of forests, and including large settlements or cities that come in the way. Tigers are increasingly now seen in such areas. We've recently heard about reports of tigers inhabiting Bhopal city. And interestingly, WWF recently had a collared tigress. And while we were monitoring her for about 6 to 8 months, we noticed she was using extensively a city around a forest area for her basic survival, and she was living mostly in the farmlands, but at late into the night she was crossing cities and human habitations perfectly well and navigating through them. And I think that is where, interestingly, there are of course opportunities being we should monitor, and maybe there's adaptation amongst the tigers towards such places in human dominated landscapes. And there's of course the downside, which is possibility of negative human wildlife interactions. There's possibility that they need better protection because one does not patrol in these spaces which are beyond protected areas. And then of course is monitoring and estimations of species. Like you mentioned, there's a number that we have right now which is 3167. That number is excluding these tigers which could be potentially living in these urban and peri-urban spaces or farmland areas as well. So what do you think is the way forward? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, drawing on my experience working on elephants and leopards, we know that in India, a large part of their range is outside these national parks and wildlife sanctuaries. So, do you think is there an estimate available for tiger numbers in these landscapes, or do we have any handle on their distribution in shared spaces in India?
No, I think that's exactly one of the opportunities we should be going ahead with. Though WWF India programs in the Terai arc are trying to focus on this, and we're trying to estimate such tigers which are inhabiting specifically the sugarcane areas in the Terai.
It's really cool.
Yeah.
So we spoke about the opportunities. So given that a large carnivore, potentially dangerous animal is sharing space with people, what do you think are the costs or the challenges of tigers sharing space with people? Challenges to both the tigers as well as the communities that share space with.
So, of course, that's sadly the downside of all these animals that we share spaces with. Of course, one is the direct cost, which is borne by communities. And I wouldn't take sides here just to say that the cost is only borne by communities, but also wildlife. And how that usually happens is that in terms of communities, they often lose life themselves. So there's loss of human life, there's loss of livestock that, on which people's livelihood depends on. And while for the animal, there are cases where there could be potential retaliation, which there are not just easy and simple instances when an animal is chased away from a farmland, but when the animal is mauled and killed as well by a mob of people. Or there are sometimes these cases where the government declares an animal as a problem animal and it's culled, which is of course the loss of an animal from its ecosystem in the sense of it. Now, those, having said that, those are what I see as the direct cost. But I think your experience more, you would be able to talk more about the indirect cost also that the communities suffer from such losses.
Sure. As you rightly said, the direct costs are more tangible and measurable. A loss of livelihood due to loss of cattle, for example, to tigers, loss of life, injury to people directly. These are more direct impacts. There are also indirect impacts of these shared spaces, as has been documented for other species as well, like elephants and leopards more popularly. Things like transaction costs, for example, if people are applying for compensation for their losses, their transaction costs, traveling to forest offices, doing all the paperwork are not accounted for. Loss of livelihood, when people are injured, for example, they lose work, sometimes they also lose their jobs. And again, when a breadwinner for a family is injured or even is killed by encounter with wildlife, then again there is feedbacks on the entire family, food security, and so on and so forth. These are some of the indirect impacts as well, which have been well studied for some of the species, but I don't think we currently have the setup to address these indirect costs so far in India.
Of course. And there are, of course, the psychological costs that
Absolutely.
the people community, the
For
trauma.
the victim who has been involved in negative encounters with tigers, and also with eyewitnesses, also they suffer a lot of trauma during these incidences. And also sometimes in some communities there could also be inherent fear. For example, this fear of wolves that's been well documented through mythological tales. There's been a fear of wolves instilled, even though per se they are not really harmful animals.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there are instances of tigers as well, where there is inherent fear in people of tigers, and that has sort of affected how they perceive the species in landscapes. Are you aware of any such instances?
Yeah, I think there's a story in Sundarbans, I believe, where the tigers are basically worshipped because of fear and because, in a way, they want to prevent such conflicts, and they worship tiger then as a deity to sort of pay homage to it, and but that's also driven by fear inherently among them, I believe.
Very interesting that you bring up this topic of religious beliefs around tigers, and it's the case with other species as well. There's a huge amount of diversity in India on how people relate to some of these species, like tigers, for example. In Maharashtra, for example, they worship tigers as Vahoba.
Correct.
There are instances in landscapes where there is a lot of negative interaction with tigers, so they're not so embedded in the religious practice or culture, and there are instances of retaliatory killings due to damages faced by people. On one end, on the other end, you can think about the either Mishmi communities of Arunachal, where they share kinship with tigers. So it's not as if they are very willingly accepting damage caused by tigers, but they have inherent coping mechanisms built into their culture and folklore to try and sort of cope with these losses to tigers. So thanks, Shreya, for the very insightful discussion on tigers, especially the opportunity for conserving tigers in shared landscapes outside the confines of national parks and protected areas or wildlife sanctuaries. So it seems like the future for tiger conservation in India lies in these shared landscapes, because the acceptance of local communities would be vital for long-term persistence of tigers in these areas, and there is a lot of scope to maybe work on policy to ensure and foster better coexistence between people and tigers in these shared landscapes by minimizing the cost and maximizing the opportunities. And I think here, in this case, when we are looking at a network of protected areas for tiger conservation at landscape level, we also need to think about how we conserve these corridors, the areas that are used by wildlife to move between protected areas. What are the infrastructure challenges, as you mentioned, and how that can be mitigated through proactive efforts. So thanks, Shreya.
Thanks a lot.
It was nice discussing with you
Sure.
in today's podcast. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aritra. Thank you for being